a lot of people, so I'm very cognizant of the fact that my audience is a lot younger than I am, generally speaking. There are a few that are older, but many are younger. And one of the things that has happened in America that I think you documented nicely in your book, I really enjoyed your chapter on Fourth Press in Chicago, because you were able to, in a fairly succinct way, demonstrate what you said initially here, that there was a day not that long ago when the Protestant establishment was the establishment. And of course, the neo-evangelicals came on the scene with Billy Graham and Carl F. Henry and that whole movement. But all of the public attention is now pointed at that movement and the heirs of the evangelical fundamentalist movement today. Recently, a couple of years ago, I picked up Jack Jenkins' book, American Prophets, The Religious Roots of Progressive Politics and the Ongoing Fight for the Soul of the Country, which tried to highlight the realities of the mainline. And one of the big stories that I think, and I think, again, as Tripp said, I was really impressed with how the honesty with which you have pursued this topic, that something has happened to the mainline. It is nearly gone. And so for many people who either A, do not participate in church at all, or identify as atheist, they might hear about Unitarian Universalists, they might see United Methodists, PCUSA churches. I mean, actually, if you look at the numbers, there's a tremendous amount of legacy churches in America today that still are part of the mainline, even though their numbers are cratering. And what you just said now was quite interesting in terms of a lot of the talent. I mean, so I'm a minister in the Christian Reformed Church, which is sort of in the middle. It's one of these ethnic denominations that is currently basically being torn in two, and that might happen this year actually, over same-sex marriage, but torn in two over these issues. And what's happening in the Christian Reformed Church is that it's either being assimilated into the evangelical fundamentalist or the mainline. And so then you have this new dynamic which has opened up, which David Brooks just wrote about recently, of the splinter within the neo-evangelicals. And that gets into, I think, the emergent movement. And I've tried to do a little bit of talking about that because there's an amazing amount of similarity between Mark Driscoll, Rob Bell, and Nadia Bolz-Weber. And you would say, well, what on earth would Mark Driscoll and Nadia Bolz-Weber have in common? They're sort of like opposites, those two. And she has now become basically the flagship pastor for a particular segment of the Lutheran Church in America. They're all pointing to her and saying, she's the future. And of course, not too many years ago, I think Tim Keller and John Piper sort of had a never Trump moment in dealing with Mark Driscoll. It's like, is this the future of our movement? Because he certainly is taking all of the attention, and there's a church planting movement. So before we really dig into the Mark Driscoll, I'd love to hear, especially for our audience, a bit of a retrospective in terms of the power that establishment Protestantism had in America. And then it's really the big story over the last 50 years in terms of church in America is really the collapse of the mainline. Because prior to that, when you have the history of, let's say, coming out of the Civil War, which was a complete victory of Northern American Protestantism, and then, of course, you have the rise of the progressive movement. Once we get into the middle of the 20th century, the slide begins, and we're seeing nothing out of the mainline Protestant movements today that suggests there's anything arresting that slide. Nadia Bolz-Weber notwithstanding.
No, yeah, I agree. I mean, Bolz-Weber she's interesting. I watched her as a kind of a young pastor, and she has her own charisma. And you wanted to believe that this was the future of the main line. But from my studies, you're exactly right, Paul. The diminishment of the main line is so dramatic. I was up for, I'm not going to tell you where, but I was up for the presidency of a possible presidency of a mainline seminary. And I looked at the books, and I looked at actually who the students, what's the quality of the students? And it was frankly shocking. And I thought to myself, no, this is not where I'm going. And I think that it's simply not, attracting talent. Holtzweber is talented, but I mean, she's talented. She's a charismatic talent, but she can't lift an institution. And an institution is constructed by many people, not just by the charismatic types. And when you think of her, you don't think Lutheran pastor, although I think she uses that as kind of a ploy to say, hey, yeah, I'm so weird, I'm a Lutheran pastor. And it is totally weird. And most people don't even know what the main line is, Paul.
Right. It's invisible in America.
Okay, it's invisible. I walk around my campus, and there used to be these mainline churches that were on the borders of our university campus, feeding and helping and serving the students. They're either blown up or dead or empty.
So then Mark Driscoll comes into Seattle and builds a significant church with networks, employs media. And I thought The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill laid this out fairly well. Employs media to gain significant influence in a certain corner of the church in the United States. And the fact that he did so, I think, in a city like Seattle, he capitalized on some of the cultural potential that Donald Trump was able to capitalize in terms of his rise to power. So talk to me about the Pacific Northwest. And Mark Driscoll is charismatic. Mark Driscoll has a terrific sense of humor. He's an excellent speaker. He's a smart man. He's all those things. Obviously got some pretty significant character flaws, but why did he succeed, and why did he succeed there? And yet I would imagine no significant political figure in Seattle or Washington was necessarily going to really try to capitalize. And basically, when it comes to public policy of Washington or the city of Seattle, boy, I better call Mark Driscoll and see if this idea is okay with him. That's not going to happen.
Guaranteed he had more influence in DC than he did in Seattle. 100%.
Yeah, that's an interesting statement. And I think right.
Yeah. I mean, in a sense, Tripp can answer these questions better than I can, but I think, he sort of caught Seattle in this transitional moment, moving from a working class city, like you kind of mentioned, Paul, to becoming kind of this high-end, high-tech type city. And in between it, you have a lot of lost, I'm not talking about you, Tripp, but young men who are kind of searching for meaning, for purpose. Often young men who are very smart, sophisticated in certain ways, and kind of wondering, like, how do I create a life? How do I even find a woman? What do I do with my life? And Driscoll kind of comes, sort of storming in with this really powerful ability to speak into young men's lives. And he did it with what? Music, and with culture, and with kind of a little bit off color, and with the idea that Jesus was no soft hippie. He was a working class guy like you and me, and he wants to save your ass, and he wants to make something of you, and I'm going to demand something of you, and I'm not going to be ashamed of the gospel. And I'm going to do it in an hysterical way. I mean, the guy was funny as hell. I don't know if he still is, but and he knows, he knows the Bible backwards and forwards. And I think he kind of found something that was really amazing. And he couldn't, I don't know, Tripp, does that explain?
No, I think that's right. I think that, and when you set all that in the backdrop of, like, we've been talking about the death of the mainline churches, in Seattle. It was the most unchurched city in North America. So you're doing that in the backdrop of a lack of any other options. Like, you didn't have, like, if you're a Christian, like, I'm moving from North Carolina, I moved there in 2008 to Seattle, right? So I'm an evangelical conservative Christian moving from North Carolina to Seattle. What are my other options exactly? Really, like, what are they? There's no other place that will make me feel like, is this actually a church? Do they actually believe the same things that I believe? Like what? It's going to be so disconcerting. So there's that. So you have part of that where you're just like, okay, you have some kind of group of people who are in Seattle who are underserved by the church, because the death of the mainline, which is really all that existed in Seattle, right? And so you have this one church with this one charismatic leader who is, like, actually not backing away from some of the core things that you believe. That he's not embarrassed about it. And in fact, he's making it front and center, and in the most controversial way. In a way, he's being the controversial figure that you don't have to be. And so, like, I'm reminded of an article that I don't know, Paul or Jim, if you guys have read any of Ben Sixsmith's stuff, but he has a really good article called "The Sad Irony of Celebrity Pastors," and he's talking about Carl Lentz, specifically. And so he's like, his problem with Carl Lentz is that he's almost too normal. He's almost not controversial enough for him. And so Ben is not a Christian, but his last paragraph, it's always stuck with me. The last paragraph says, "I am not religious, so it is not my place to dictate to Christians what they should and should not believe. Still, if someone has a faith worth following, I feel that their beliefs should make me feel uncomfortable for not doing so. If they share 90% of my lifestyle and values, then there's nothing especially inspiring about them. Instead of making me want to become more like them, it looks very much as if they want to become more like me." And that, like, Mars Hill had that, but the opposite. They weren't trying to conform to Seattle cultural standards or politics or anything else. They stood out in that way. They were, at least, like, the way they viewed themselves, it was a city on a hill, right? It's a light in the midst of a bunch of darkness. And so you had that combined with a culture that was not telling boys, like, a lot of the guys that were in community groups and I did Bible studies with, they had no fathers figures. They did not grow up in the church. They had, like, this was a father figure to them in a certain way, and the church was fulfilling that role, and Mark was fulfilling that role in their lives, and so they were going for it. Like, this was the city on the hill for them, and so they were drawn to it. And the fact that they weren't backing down was actually an attractive element to Mars Hill in Seattle. That honestly, I don't think it would work. I don't think that if Mark Driscoll had done this in Alabama, it would have been nearly as successful. I don't think it would have. I think the fact that it was in Seattle, or maybe he could have done it in Portland, but like the fact that it was there that he was doing this was in fact part of the secret sauce that made the whole thing kind of work in a certain way.
Yeah, I was just thinking, he demanded something from you.
Yeah.
You know, he didn't underestimate who you were.
Right.
He maybe even overestimated what you could do. Not you in particular, but you know, Tripp, I mean, for the same reason, when I picked up The Cost of Discipleship, Dietrich Bonhoeffer's book, you know, he basically said to me through that book, and I still think of it today. He said, when Christ calls you, he calls you to come and die. You know, that's a no shit Sherlock point of view. That is, you know, the gospel is demanding. The gospel is demanding, and it demands not just your pocketbook, your whole life. Take up your cross and follow me. And so, you know, for young idealistic young men, or at least kind of potentially idealistic young men, wow, that's kind of a real message.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always been, you know, and I've always been, if I'm a Christian, it's because of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It's because he basically said, take up your cross and you must follow me. And if necessary, you must die for me. And who else are you going to do that for?
Right.
You know what I mean?
And I actually think that's a message that it resonates on all kinds of levels. It's why I think that Peterson is so popular with young men too. Like, it's why when Peterson came to Seattle to do his, you know, one of his, you know, it's a sold out theater, lines around the block, you know, with all these people coming, and a lot of them young men, is because that's a message that they're longing to hear, that I have a purpose. But that purpose, it's like an adventure, right? It's something that's demanded of me. I need to sacrifice for this. There's some role that I have to play here that is demanded of me. It's something that I think that especially young men want to hear. And, you know, Peterson would probably argue, you know, as he did with Captain Newman, like, what kind of woman would you want to, like, what kind of man would you want to marry to a young woman? You know, is it like a child who, you know, doesn't think that there's anything demanded of them, or do you want something else? And so, like, I think that that's one, like, I met my wife at Mars Hill. There's a reason that women were going to Mars Hill too. It wasn't just like the young men, sure, but like there were a lot of college girls at Mars Hill. That was also part of the appeal as well. And so, but Mark, I mean, he has that famous sermon where he's like essentially spending the entire sermon yelling at men, just absolutely yelling at men, and, you know, married men, single men, and like just the whole sermon is just that. Yeah. It's a very weird way to try and attract men, but it worked. It absolutely worked.
It's, you know, I mean, I've listened to Peterson, and, you know, he's not my hero, but what I think he does.
You're a little old for that.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But what I try to do, you know, when I teach my Life Worth Living course, is I kind of, you know, occasionally I say, this is what your life can become. And the question is, will you take it up? I don't kind of use the language of faith so much as like, take up your cross, follow me. But I say, it's up to you as to whether or not you're going to make the life you really want. And I still have guys who, you know, young men in particular, who call me up and say, Wellman, you know how that goes sometimes. Wellman, I love that class. You know, I just love you. And it's kind of embarrassing, but I mean, I just think that's just a part of what young men in particular need, and want. But our culture is either afraid to do that, or they want to tamp down men, or I don't know what I think men are really a conundrum. What do you do with men?
Mhm.
What do you do with them? And you give them beer, you sell them pornography, what do you do?
Yeah.
And I think Driscoll and what I would say is, you know, the Christian way: take up your cross, serve others. You know, I've had 4 kids. Now, why did I do that? I have 2 young kids, and I'm an old guy. I did it because I thought this is the most beautiful way to live a life serving the ones I truly love. And so I will give my life for them. And what else would I do? Go to Hawaii? You know what I mean?
You could have. Yeah.
You're pulling a page from John Piper right there.
Yeah.
You know, that's a big John Piper sermon right there.
Oh, is it really?
It is.
Jim,
Now,
the evangelical. I knew we'd get him.
Yeah.
But I
No,
think
there's something to it. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
and you want to be around men who have some purpose, who have some
Mhm.
meaning, who have some direction, who aren't just, you know, excuse my language, but just fucking around. You know what I mean?
Well, and see, this is the thing. This is what also makes it a little bit dangerous. And what happened with Mars Hill is that you want to be around men who have purpose, or you feel have purpose, you perceive as having purpose, you have like that kind of drive and that kind of call, which makes men like Mark Driscoll like, if you can convince people, if you can display that confidence that like, I've got purpose for you, I can do these kind of things, then you will get men to follow you into battle where you're just using them for various purposes. And so that's where it becomes difficult, because in a certain sense, I really like what Driscoll did with Mars Hill. I really like that he was actually, like, in certain ways, he was calling men to a higher calling than what was being called by the culture of Seattle, or what is still being called by the culture of Seattle. And yet it was being called to his purposes as well. And that's the sad part about it. And that's what, like, my big regret about being part of it was that it's sad to me that it was not pure, I guess. And that's kind of maybe a foolish thing for me to want in this life, but that's my big regret about it, is that it wasn't something more than what it was.
Yeah. No, and I hear you. I really hear that, Tripp, because I mean, I sense that from you, that you needed him at some level, and I'm not saying that as a kind of you know, as a put downer in any way at all. I think men need somebody to look up to as a hero, in some form, and then as a guide. And if they don't have that, they tend to wander, and God knows what they do. In our culture, you know, I think, you know, Paul, I think you're exactly right. I think Jordan Peterson is a guide for men, and I think women look on and they go, many do, they say, thank God you're getting my husband off his ass to do something. And I like listening to Jordan. I'm not a huge fan of his, but you can see you can see the passion in him. He's saying, you have a life. Don't waste it. And I mean, my God, what's wrong with that?